The whiskey burned going down, but it was the second glass that killed him, or should have. Marshal Eli Quinn collapsed face first into the wedding cake before 300 witnesses, his body convulsing on the dance floor of the Cheyenne Grand Hotel, and the last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him whole was his bride's face transforming from radiant joy into something cold, calculating, and terrifyingly competent. "Everyone get back." Josephine Mercer's voice cracked across the ballroom like a gunshot, silencing the string quartet mid-note. Her wedding dress, ivory silk with 100 tiny pearl buttons that had taken her sister 2 hours to fasten that morning, was already stained with frosting and something darker as she dropped to her knees beside her new husband's shaking body. "Someone poisoned him," she said, and there was no hysteria in her voice, only a terrible clinical certainty that made the wedding guests freeze in place. "Strychnine, most likely, given the muscle rigidity. I need hot water, mustard powder if the kitchen has it, and someone to hold his jaw open. Now." The guests stared at her as though she had sprouted a second head. This delicate creature in her wedding finery, this woman they had all assumed was merely the marshal's pretty young bride from back east, was barking orders like a field surgeon. "Josephine," gasped her new mother-in-law, Constance Quinn, clutching her pearls. "What are you saying? What are you doing?" "I'm saving his life," Josephine snapped, already tearing at Eli's collar with fingers that did not shake despite the chaos around her. "Someone in this room just tried to murder my husband, and I intend to make certain they fail. Deputy Harmon, I need you to secure that punch bowl immediately. Do not let anyone touch it. Do not let anyone empty it. It may be evidence." Deputy Harmon, a broad-shouldered young man who had spent the last 6 months watching Marshal Quinn court this mysterious woman with growing suspicion, found himself moving before he had even decided to obey her. There was something in her voice, some bedrock of authority, that brooked no argument. Eli's body arched again, his boot heels drumming against the polished floor, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. Josephine pressed 2 fingers to his throat, counting silently, her lips moving as she calculated his racing pulse. 140 beats a minute, she murmured to herself. "Rising. We do not have much time." The bartender arrived with a pitcher of hot water, his hands trembling so badly that half of it sloshed onto the floor. Josephine snatched a coffee cup from a nearby table, filled it, and began mixing in a spoonful of the mustard powder the kitchen had produced. "Hold him," she commanded 2 of the groomsmen, who had been Eli's deputies for years and had never once taken an order from a woman in a wedding dress. They obeyed anyway, some primal instinct telling them that questioning her now would cost their friend his life. She forced Eli's jaw open, poured the mixture down his throat, and immediately turned his head to the side. "This will make him vomit," she announced to the horrified crowd. "It is meant to. Strychnine must be expelled from the stomach before it fully absorbs into the bloodstream. I need everyone to stop staring and someone to fetch me my medical bag from the boarding house. It is under my bed, a black leather case with brass fittings. Run." A young boy who had been serving as ring bearer sprinted from the ballroom without being asked twice. Eli's body convulsed again, and Josephine held his head steady with a strength that surprised even herself, whispering words meant only for him amid the screaming and the chaos. "Stay with me, Eli Quinn. I did not travel 2,000 miles and survive things you cannot imagine just to bury you on our wedding day. You fight this. You hear me? You fight." Nobody in that ballroom, not his mother, not his deputies, not the assembled cream of Cheyenne society who had come to witness the union of the town's beloved marshal and his refined Eastern bride, had any notion that the woman now saving his life with the calm precision of a battlefield surgeon had a past far darker and more complicated than any of them could have imagined. To understand how they arrived at this moment, one must go back 6 months, to the day Josephine Mercer stepped off the stagecoach into the dust and chaos of Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, carrying nothing but a single trunk and a secret that could get her hanged. The year was 1878, and the town of Cheyenne was still young enough to smell of fresh-cut lumber and old enough to have accumulated its share of violence, corruption, and buried secrets. Marshal Eli Quinn had been keeping the peace there for 3 years, ever since he had ridden in from Kansas with a tin star and a reputation for fairness that had, more than once, made him enemies among the cattle barons and railroad men who preferred lawmen they could purchase. Eli was 32 years old, built like a man who had spent his life wrestling steers and breaking horses, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a Wyoming sky before a storm. He had never married, a fact that had scandalized the local matchmaking mothers for years, though the truth was simpler than any of them guessed. Eli Quinn had watched too many good women die too young on this unforgiving frontier, and he had decided long ago that a lawman's wife was a widow waiting to happen. That resolution crumbled the moment he saw Josephine Mercer step down from the stagecoach. She was not, by the standards of Cheyenne's beauty contests, the most striking woman in town. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe braid rather than curled in the fashionable style, and her traveling dress was practical wool rather than silk. But there was something in the way she carried herself, spine straight, chin-level gray eyes taking in the entire dusty street in a single sweeping assessment, that struck Eli like a physical blow. "You would be Miss Mercer," he said, stepping forward to help her with her trunk. "I am Marshal Eli Quinn. Dr. Abernathy's expecting you at the clinic." "I can manage my own trunk, Marshal," she replied, though her tone held no rudeness, only a kind of automatic independence that seemed woven into her very bones. "But I thank you for the escort. This town looks rougher than the pamphlets suggested." "Pamphlets always lie," Eli said, unable to stop the corner of his mouth from lifting. "Cheyenne's rough as a cob and twice as loud. You sure you want to stay?" Josephine had looked at him then, really looked, with an assessment so thorough he felt as though she were reading his entire life history in his face. "I did not come here for comfort, Marshal Quinn. I came here for purpose." That answer, cryptic as it was, had lodged itself in Eli's mind and refused to leave. Josephine Mercer had come to Cheyenne ostensibly as a nurse, hired by the aging Dr. Abernathy to assist with the growing medical needs of a boomtown that had outpaced its infrastructure. What none of them knew, what Josephine had buried deep beneath careful lies and a manufactured biography, was that she was in fact a fully trained physician, one of the first women to graduate from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and that she had fled the East Coast under circumstances so dangerous that she had changed her name twice before settling on the alias that felt safest. Her dark past, the one she guarded with the same fierce independence she brought to everything else in her life, involved a wealthy and powerful family in Philadelphia, a husband she had never wanted, and a forced marriage arrangement that had turned deadly when she discovered her intended husband was systematically poisoning his own father to inherit the family fortune early. Josephine, trained in the very science he had weaponized, had recognized the symptoms immediately. The same slow degradation, the same characteristic tremors, the arsenic accumulating in small doses meant to look like natural decline. When she had confronted him, gently, professionally, hoping to save an old man's life without destroying his son's future, her intended husband had turned on her with a fury that revealed the monster beneath his charming exterior. She had fled that very night, taking only what she could carry, leaving behind her medical diploma, her family's expectations, and any hope of practicing medicine openly under her true name and credentials. Women physicians were rare enough in 1878, without one running from a scandal involving poison and a prominent family's dark secrets. She had reinvented herself as a nurse, a role society found acceptable for a woman, and buried her medical training beneath careful humility, revealing her true skill only when circumstances demanded it, and no one was paying close enough attention to ask uncomfortable questions. In Cheyenne, working alongside Dr. Abernathy, she had found something resembling peace. The old doctor was half-blind and often drunk by afternoon, which meant Josephine ended up performing most of the clinic's actual medical work while he took credit, and she took satisfaction in simply being useful again, even if it meant hiding half of what she knew. It was inevitable, perhaps, that Marshal Eli Quinn would become a frequent visitor to that clinic. Lawmen collected injuries the way other men collected debts, and over the following months, Josephine treated him for a knife wound across his ribs after a bar brawl turned violent, a broken finger from a horse that objected to being shod, and a fever that had nearly taken him after he spent 3 days tracking cattle rustlers through a spring blizzard. It was during that fever, when Dr. Abernathy had retired for the evening, leaving Josephine alone to manage the crisis, that Eli first witnessed the truth of her abilities, though he did not yet understand its full significance. He remembered fragments of that night, feverish and disconnected, her cool hands checking his pulse with a precision that felt different from ordinary nursing, her voice murmuring calculations about dosages and intervals that sounded almost like a foreign language, the way she had diagnosed pneumonia developing in his left lung before even Dr. Abernathy's stethoscope confirmed it the next morning. "You knew," Eli said to her, weeks later, once he had recovered enough to string sentences together without his mind wandering. "Before the doctor even listened to my chest, you already knew what was wrong with me." "I have good instincts," Josephine had replied, deflecting with the ease of long practice. "Any nurse worth her salary learns to recognize patterns." But Eli Quinn had not survived years of reading liars and outlaws by taking such deflections at face value. He filed the observation away, along with a dozen others. The Latin phrases she sometimes murmured under her breath while working, the way she handled a scalpel with more confidence than seemed appropriate for basic nursing duties, the medical texts he had glimpsed once in her room that seemed far too advanced for someone claiming only rudimentary training. He did not press her on these mysteries, not yet, because he had begun to fall in love with her, slowly and completely, in the way a man falls when he has spent years guarding his heart and finally meets someone worth the risk. Their courtship, when it finally began in earnest, was unlike anything Cheyenne society had witnessed. Josephine Mercer did not simper or flirt in the accepted fashion. She argued with Eli about territorial politics, challenged his assumptions about law and justice, and once spent an entire evening debating the ethics of frontier medicine with such passionate intelligence that Eli found himself falling harder with every word. "You are the most infuriating woman I have ever met," he told her one evening in early autumn, as they walked along the edge of town where the prairie stretched golden and endless toward the mountains. "Is that meant to be a compliment, Marshal Quinn?" "It is the finest compliment I know how to give," he said, and meant it entirely. "Every other woman in this town treats me like I might break if they disagree too strongly. You treat me like I can handle the truth." "I have found," Josephine said carefully, "that men rarely appreciate women who speak their minds." "Then you have been meeting the wrong sort of men," Eli replied, and something in his tone, some fierce protective certainty, made Josephine's carefully guarded heart skip in a way she had not allowed it to skip in years. Their romance deepened through the winter months, built on stolen moments between his law enforcement duties and her clinic responsibilities. He taught her to shoot properly, laughing with delight rather than condescension when she proved to be a natural marksman, her steady hands and clinical patience translating perfectly to accuracy with a revolver. "Where did a nurse learn to hold a gun like that?" he asked, genuinely stunned, after she put 5 shots into a tin can at 30 paces without hesitation. "My father believed all his children should know how to defend themselves," she said, which was true enough, though she omitted that her father had been a surgeon who insisted his daughters receive the same rigorous education as his sons, medical training included. Eli proposed to her on Christmas Eve, kneeling in the snow outside the clinic with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and Josephine Mercer, who had sworn after Philadelphia that she would never again trust a man with her heart or her secrets, found herself saying yes before she had fully decided to risk everything on this rugged, honest lawman who looked at her like she was the most remarkable creature he had ever encountered. But secrets, buried deep as they might be, have a way of surfacing at the most dangerous moments, and Josephine's past was about to collide with her present in a manner that would nearly cost Eli Quinn his life. Unbeknownst to either of them, word of the wedding had traveled further than Cheyenne's dusty streets. A telegram had reached Philadelphia 3 weeks before the ceremony, sent by a distant cousin of Josephine's who had recognized her name in a newspaper account of the upcoming Marshal's wedding, syndicated in papers across the territory as a charming frontier romance. That telegram had found its way to Reginald Thorne, the man Josephine had fled 6 months prior, the very man whose murderous ambitions had forced her into hiding. Reginald had inherited his father's fortune after all. The old man finally succumbing to the poison, Reginald continued administering after Josephine's flight removed the only witness who might have stopped him. But inheriting money had not satisfied Reginald's darker appetites. He had spent months searching for the woman who had discovered his crime and escaped before he could silence her permanently. When he learned she was marrying a small-town marshal in Wyoming territory, Reginald Thorne saw not just an opportunity for revenge, but a chance to eliminate the only person alive who could testify to his father's murder, while simultaneously destroying whatever happiness she had dared to build for herself. He had arrived in Cheyenne 4 days before the wedding, traveling under an assumed name, presenting himself as a cattle buyer from Chicago interested in the local market. His new identity gave him easy access to the wedding preparations, and his considerable wealth purchased the discretion of a corrupt hotel employee, willing to slip a lethal dose of strychnine into the marshal's private glass of celebratory whiskey during the reception. Reginald's plan was elegant in its cruelty. Poison the groom during the wedding itself, forcing Josephine to watch her new husband die on what should have been the happiest day of her life, then disappear before anyone could connect the tragedy to anything beyond simple bad luck or perhaps a jealous rival. What Reginald Thorne had not accounted for, what no one in Cheyenne truly understood until that terrible moment when Eli collapsed onto his own wedding cake, was that Josephine Mercer possessed exactly the skills necessary to save her husband's life, skills she had spent months carefully hiding from everyone, including the man she loved. Now, kneeling on the ballroom floor with her wedding dress ruined and her hands steady despite the screaming chaos around her, Josephine fought to save Eli's life, while simultaneously confronting the terrible realization that her past had followed her here, that someone in this room had tried to murder the man she loved, and that she alone possessed both the knowledge to save him and the terrible certainty of who had likely done this and why. "The vomiting has helped," she announced to the crowd, checking Eli's pulse again, watching his convulsions begin to subside slightly. But strychnine acts quickly and thoroughly. I need him kept calm, kept still. Any sudden stimulation can trigger the convulsions again. Someone dim these lights. The rest of you back away, give him air. Dr. Abernathy finally arrived, pushing through the crowd with his black bag, took one look at what Josephine was doing, and to his eternal credit, immediately deferred to her judgment rather than asserting his own authority. "What do you need, Josephine?" he asked quietly. "Charcoal, if you have it prepared. It will help absorb whatever poison remains unmetabolized. And I need this room cleared except for essential help. Too much noise, too much light, it all risks triggering another convulsive episode." Deputy Harmon, still guarding the punch bowl as instructed, called out, "Marshall's mother wants to know if we should send for the train to get a proper doctor from Denver." "There is no time for Denver," Josephine said firmly. "Denver is 6 hours away by rail, assuming the tracks are clear and the train departs immediately. Eli Quinn does not have 6 hours if this poison continues its course unchecked. I am the doctor he has, and I am not leaving his side." The word doctor, spoken so plainly, so certainly, hung in the air like a physical thing. Several guests exchanged glances, but the crisis was too immediate, too terrifying for anyone to question her word choice. Eli's convulsions gradually subsided over the following hour, though his breathing remained shallow and his skin held a grayish pallor that worried Josephine more than she let show on her face. She had him moved to a private room upstairs, away from the curious crowd, and there, with only Dr. Abernathy and Deputy Harmon present, she continued her vigil through the night. "You are more than a nurse," Dr. Abernathy said quietly, sometime after midnight, watching her calculate dosages and monitor Eli's vital signs with a precision that no ordinary nursing education could have provided. "I am whatever this town needs me to be tonight," Josephine replied, not looking up from where she was checking Eli's pupils for signs of continued neurological distress. "That is not an answer, my dear. It is the only answer I can give right now, doctor. Please help me watch him. We are not out of danger yet." Eli drifted in and out of consciousness through the long night, his body fighting the remnants of the poison while Josephine monitored every breath, every twitch, every subtle sign that might indicate improvement or crisis. Around 3 in the morning, his eyes finally opened, clear and focused for the first time since his collapse. "Josephine," he rasped, his voice raw from the earlier convulsions. "I am here," she said immediately, taking his hand in both of hers. "You are safe. The poison is working its way out of your system. You gave us quite a scare, Marshal Quinn." "Someone poisoned me," he said, memory returning in fragmented pieces. "At our wedding." Who would he stopped, seeing something in her expression that made his lawman instincts sharpen despite his weakened state. "Josephine, you knew immediately what it was. You knew exactly what to do. How?" This was the moment Josephine had dreaded for months, the moment her carefully constructed identity would either survive scrutiny or crumble entirely. She could lie again, deflect again, claim instinct or luck or simple observation. But looking at this man who had just nearly died, who deserved better than more secrets between them, she made a decision that would change everything. "I am a physician, Eli," she said quietly. "A fully trained doctor, graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. I have been hiding this fact since I arrived in Cheyenne, presenting myself as merely a nurse, because society is not kind to women who dare to practice medicine openly, and because I was running from a dark past that I feared would follow me if anyone learned the truth of who I really am." Eli stared at her, processing this revelation through the fog of his recovering mind. "A doctor," he repeated. "You have been a doctor this entire time. You saved my life tonight because you actually knew what you were doing, not because you got lucky with some nursing instinct." "Yes, Josephine, that is." He struggled to find words adequate to the moment. "That is extraordinary. Why would you ever hide something like that?" And so, in the quiet hours before dawn, with Dr. Abernathy dozing in a corner chair and Deputy Harmon standing guard outside the door, Josephine Mercer finally told her new husband the complete truth of her past. She told him about her father, a respected Philadelphia surgeon who had insisted his daughters receive the same education as sons, about her acceptance into medical college, despite the fierce opposition of a society that believed women too delicate for such rigorous study, about her graduation, one of only a handful of women physicians in the entire country at that time. She told him about the arranged marriage her family had pressed upon her, to Reginald Thorne, heir to a shipping fortune, a match that promised financial security and social advancement for her family. She told him about discovering, through her medical training, that Reginald was slowly poisoning his own father with small doses of arsenic, hoping to inherit the family fortune before his father could disinherit him for his gambling debts and dissolute lifestyle. She told him about confronting Reginald privately, hoping to reason with him, to convince him to stop before his father died, and before she was forced to report the crime to authorities. She told him about the terrifying transformation she witnessed, the charming society gentleman revealing himself as something cold and dangerous, threatening her life if she ever spoke of what she had discovered. She told him about fleeing Philadelphia that very night, changing her name, abandoning her medical credentials and family connections, traveling west to disappear into the vast anonymity of the frontier, eventually landing in Cheyenne under an assumed history that concealed her true training and background. Eli listened to this entire confession without interrupting, his expression cycling through shock, sympathy, and finally a deep, burning anger on her behalf. "This Reginald Thorne," he said slowly once she had finished, "you believe he is somehow connected to what happened tonight?" "I do not know for certain," Josephine admitted, "but the timing feels too coincidental to ignore. A telegram announcing our wedding would have been easy enough for someone to trace, especially given how the local papers syndicated the story. If Reginald learned where I was, learned that I was marrying you, he might see this as an opportunity to eliminate the only witness to his father's murder while simultaneously destroying whatever happiness I dared to find." Eli's jaw tightened, his lawman instincts fully engaged despite his physical weakness. "Then we need to find out if he came to Cheyenne. We need to search for any stranger who arrived in the days before the wedding, anyone with connections to Philadelphia, anyone who might have had access to the reception. Eli, you nearly died tonight. You need rest, not investigation. I need to know who tried to kill me on our wedding day," he said firmly, though his voice remained weak. "And I need to know that you are safe from a man capable of murder and willing to travel across the country to silence a witness to his crimes." Despite her medical training insisting he needed complete rest, Josephine recognized the stubborn determination in her husband's eyes, the same quality that had made him an effective marshal for years. She understood, too, that leaving this threat unaddressed would mean living in constant fear, always looking over their shoulders, never truly safe from Reginald Thorne's reach. "Then we investigate together," she said finally, "but you rest first, at least until morning. I am not risking your health further, not after everything it took to keep you alive tonight." Eli managed a weak smile despite his exhaustion, bossy for a wife of less than 12 hours. "You married a physician, Marshal Quinn. Get used to being told what is good for your health." Dawn broke over Cheyenne with Eli sleeping fitfully but stably, his color returning to something approaching normal, his vital signs steadying under Josephine's continued vigilant care. Deputy Harmon, who had spent the night guarding the door and the confiscated punch bowl, brought news as the sun climbed higher. "Marshall's mother wants to see him," he reported quietly to Josephine in the hallway. "And the hotel staff mentioned something odd. There was a guest who checked out in the middle of the night, real sudden like, didn't even wait for his morning coffee. Chicago cattle buyer, or so he claimed. Fellow named Reynolds." Josephine's blood ran cold. Reynolds. Close enough to Reginald that it could easily be an alias chosen by someone unfamiliar with the need for complete anonymity, or perhaps arrogant enough to believe he would never be caught. "Deputy Harmon," she said carefully, "I need you to gather every detail you can about this Mr. Reynolds. His appearance, where he claimed to be staying before Cheyenne, anyone he spoke with during his time here. This may be the man who poisoned Marshal Quinn." Harmon's expression sharpened with professional interest. "You think this is connected to something from your past, ma'am? Begging your pardon, but the way you handled things last night, the things you knew, that wasn't just nursing skill." "You are more observant than most, Deputy," Josephine said. "Yes, I believe this connects to circumstances I fled 6 months ago. I will explain everything once Eli is stronger, but for now, please gather what information you can. This man may still be in the territory, and he is dangerous." The investigation that followed over the next several days revealed a trail of careful deception. The mysterious Mr. Reynolds had indeed arrived in Cheyenne 4 days before the wedding, presenting impeccable credentials as a Chicago cattle buyer, credentials that, upon closer examination by the local bank where he had briefly opened an account, proved to contain subtle inconsistencies that suggested forgery. He had befriended one of the hotel's kitchen staff, a young man named Thomas Whitfield, who had recently accumulated gambling debts at the local saloon, offering him $50, an enormous sum for a kitchen worker, to add a certain white powder to a specific glass of whiskey during the wedding reception. When Deputy Harmon and Eli, now recovering enough to participate in the investigation though still weak, confronted Thomas Whitfield with evidence of his bank deposits matching the timeline of the poisoning, the young man broke down immediately, confessing everything in exchange for leniency. He said it was just a prank, Thomas insisted, tears streaming down his face. Said it would just make the marshal sick for his wedding night, embarrass him a little. I did not know it was poison, I swear it, Marshal. I did not know he might die. Where did this Reynolds go after he paid you? Eli demanded, his voice hard despite his continued physical weakness. I do not know, sir. He said he was leaving on the early train to Denver, said his business in Cheyenne was concluded. That is all I know, I swear it. The trail led to the Cheyenne train depot, where the station master confirmed that a man matching Reynolds' description had indeed purchased a ticket to Denver on the early morning train, the same night Eli had nearly died. From Denver, the trail grew colder, though telegrams to authorities in Colorado and beyond confirmed that a man using various aliases matching Reginald Thorne's general description had been spotted traveling south, possibly heading toward New Mexico territory or further into unclaimed frontier, where extradition and pursuit became increasingly difficult. He escaped, Eli said grimly, sitting in his office 3 days after the wedding, still moving carefully as his body continued recovering from the poison's effects. The man who tried to murder me, who terrorized you for months, simply vanished into the frontier. For now, Josephine said, though worry creased her forehead. But Reginald Thorne is not a patient man, Eli. He came all this way to silence me, to destroy what happiness we found together. I do not believe he will simply give up and disappear forever. Then we prepare for him to try again, Eli said, his lawman instincts fully engaged now that his strength was returning. And this time, we make certain he does not escape justice. Over the following weeks, as Eli's health fully returned, and their marriage settled into the rhythms of ordinary life interrupted by extraordinary danger, Josephine and Eli worked together, combining her medical knowledge with his investigative experience, to build a case against Reginald Thorne that would hold up not just in the court of frontier justice, but potentially in extradition proceedings that might eventually bring him back to Philadelphia to face charges for his father's murder. Josephine wrote carefully worded letters to former colleagues at her medical college, trusted friends who had known her before her flight, asking them to quietly gather evidence about Reginald's father's death, about the symptoms that had led to his demise, about any physical evidence that might still exist to prove the poisoning that Josephine alone had originally detected. "This is dangerous," Eli said one evening, watching her compose another careful letter by lamplight in their small house on the edge of town. "If word reaches Reginald that you are actively building a case against him, he may become even more desperate." "I would rather face desperate danger openly than live forever in fear of what might happen," Josephine replied. "I spent 6 months running, Eli. I am done running. If Reginald Thorne wants to finish what he started, he will have to come through both of us together, and this time I will not be caught unprepared." Eli's admiration for his wife, already substantial after witnessing her save his life with such calm competence, deepened further with each passing week as he watched her methodically build a legal and medical case that few trained physicians, let alone women denied full recognition of their medical training, could have constructed with such precision. "You continue to astonish me," he told her one night, watching her review medical texts she had finally allowed herself to display openly in their home, no longer needing to hide her true expertise now that Cheyenne had witnessed firsthand what she was capable of. Every day I discover some new depth to you that I never expected. Is that troubling for you? Josephine asked, genuine concern in her voice despite months of marriage that should have reassured her of his acceptance. Some men find it difficult to be married to a woman more educated than themselves in certain matters. Eli set down the ledger he had been reviewing and crossed the room to where she sat, kneeling before her chair to look directly into her eyes. Josephine Mercer Quinn, I have never in my life met a woman like you. You saved my life with knowledge and skill that put every doctor in this territory to shame. You survived a murderer's threats and rebuilt your entire existence through sheer determination and intelligence. You debate law and medicine and philosophy with more insight than most university professors I have encountered. If anything troubles me, it is only that I fear I am not worthy of such a remarkable partner. That is the most ridiculous thing I have ever heard you say, Josephine said, though tears gathered in her eyes at his words. You are the bravest, most honorable man I have ever known. You did not flinch from the truth of my past, did not treat my education as some kind of threat to your masculine pride. You have supported every effort I have made to seek justice against Reginald, even knowing the danger it might bring to our door. I do not deserve you either, Eli Quinn, if we are trading in such foolish notions of worthiness. He kissed her then, slowly and deeply, all the passion and respect and genuine partnership of their unusual courtship distilled into that single moment of connection. Their marriage, born in crisis and near tragedy, had grown into something neither of them had quite expected, a true meeting of equals, where her medical brilliance and his lawman's courage combined to create a partnership stronger than either could have built alone. But their peace was not destined to last uninterrupted. 2 months after the wedding, as autumn began transitioning toward the harsh Wyoming winter, a telegram arrived that shattered their fragile sense of security. Josephine received it while Eli was out on patrol, delivered by a young telegraph office boy who seemed nervous about its contents. She opened it with hands that had grown steady over months of frontier life, only to feel that steadiness crumble as she read the message. Know where you are, stop, know what you told your husband, stop, this ends soon, stop, RTHORNE. The telegram had been sent from Laramie, barely a day's ride from Cheyenne, confirming her worst fears that Reginald had not fled permanently but had instead been circling, waiting for the right opportunity to strike again. When Eli returned that evening to find his wife pale but composed, the telegram clutched in her hand, his expression darkened with a fury that Josephine had rarely witnessed from her generally even-tempered husband. "He is close," Eli said, reading the message twice. "This changes everything. We cannot simply wait for him to make his next move. We need to hunt him before he hunts us." "Eli, this is exactly what he wants," Josephine said, though her medical training could not entirely suppress the fear coursing through her. "He wants us reactive, frightened, making mistakes born of panic. I refuse to give him that satisfaction." "Then what do you propose?" Eli asked, respect evident even amid his anger, respect for a partner who consistently refused to be treated as merely a victim requiring protection. "We set a trap of our own," Josephine said, her mind already working through the possibilities with the same clinical precision she brought to medical diagnosis. "Reginald believes he holds power over me because of what I know about his father's murder. But that power only exists if I remain silent, if the evidence remains buried. What if we make it known, publicly, that I have already sent detailed evidence to authorities in Philadelphia? What if his coming after us now serves only to confirm his guilt rather than silence the threat?" Eli considered this, his lawman instincts recognizing the strategic value of her proposal. "You want to flush him out by removing his motive for silence." "Precisely. If killing me no longer protects him from prosecution, If the evidence exists independent of my continued survival, his primary reason for pursuing us disappears. He may still come out of pure vindictive rage, but he will be acting from desperation rather than calculated advantage, and desperate men make mistakes. Together, they crafted a careful plan. Josephine wrote to her contacts in Philadelphia, formally submitting evidence she had gathered about the elder Thorne's poisoning, evidence that included detailed medical observations from her time treating the dying man, timeline discrepancies in Reginald's alibi, and testimony from servants who had witnessed suspicious behavior that they had been too frightened to report, while Reginald controlled the family fortune. They ensured, through careful conversations with trusted allies and subtle information leaked through the local newspaper, that word would eventually reach Reginald Thorne, that his crimes were now formally documented and pursued by authorities independent of Josephine's personal testimony. Her death would no longer protect him. It would merely add another murder charge to his existing troubles. The strategy worked, though not in the manner either of them had fully anticipated. 3 weeks after sending their carefully orchestrated information, on a bitter November evening when the first serious snow of the season had begun blanketing Cheyenne in white silence, Reginald Thorne finally revealed himself, not through subtle poison or distant telegram threats, but through direct, desperate confrontation. Josephine was alone in the clinic, having stayed late to treat a difficult breech birth that had taxed even her considerable skills, when she heard the front door open despite the late hour and the storm raging outside. "Dr. Abernathy," she called out, expecting perhaps an emergency patient seeking help despite the weather. "Not quite the title you deserve to use so freely," came a voice she recognized instantly, sending ice through her veins colder than the winter storm outside. "Hello, Josephine, or should I say Dr. Mercer? It has been far too long." Reginald Thorne stepped into the lamplight, and Josephine was struck by how much he had changed in the months since her flight. His once immaculate appearance had deteriorated into something haggard and wild-eyed, his expensive coat now stained and worn from weeks of desperate travel. He held a revolver, its barrel trained directly at her chest. "Reginald," she said, forcing calm into her voice despite her racing heart, her physician's training helping her maintain composure even in the face of mortal danger. "You look unwell, the strain of your crimes catching up with you at last." "Do not lecture me about crimes," he snarled, taking another step closer. "You destroyed everything I built, everything I worked for. My father's fortune, my reputation, my future, all gone because you could not simply mind your own affairs and let an old man die peacefully." "You murdered him," Josephine said flatly, her medical outrage overriding her fear. "You slowly poisoned your own father for money. There is no version of events where that becomes acceptable simply because I discovered the truth. And now authorities in Philadelphia have that truth regardless of whether you live or die," Reginald said, his eyes wild with the particular madness of a man who has lost everything and has nothing left to lose. "So you might wonder why I have come all this way, risked everything to find you now." "Revenge," Josephine said simply. "Pure, pointless revenge, because you cannot bear the thought of me surviving to build a new life while your own crumbles around you." "Perhaps," Reginald admitted, his hand steady on the revolver despite the madness in his eyes. "Or perhaps I simply wish to finish what should have happened months ago, before your martial husband's timely wedding day rescue interrupted my plans." He cocked the revolver, and Josephine understood with sudden clarity that she was facing the actual moment of her death, that all her medical training and careful strategizing had led to this final confrontation, with a man too broken by his own crimes to be reasoned with any longer. But Josephine Mercer had not survived this long, had not rebuilt her entire life through determination and intelligence, only to surrender now without a fight. "Before you shoot me," she said, her voice remaining remarkably steady, "you should know that I anticipated this exact confrontation, Reginald. I am not nearly as helpless as your dying father was." Her hand, which had been resting near the medical supplies on the examination table beside her, closed around a scalpel she had positioned there earlier that evening, part of the careful preparation she had made once Eli had insisted she never work alone at the clinic without some means of defense close at hand. As Reginald's finger tightened on the trigger, Josephine moved with the speed and precision that had marked every aspect of her medical training, throwing herself sideways as she flung a tray of surgical instruments toward his face. The distraction bought her precious seconds as his shot went wide, embedding in the wall behind where she had been standing. The struggle that followed was brief but intense. Josephine's medical knowledge of human anatomy, ironically the same knowledge that had originally exposed Reginald's crimes, now served her in defense as she drove the scalpel into the tendon behind his gun hand's wrist with surgical precision, causing him to drop the weapon with a scream of pain and shock. But Reginald, despite his injury, was still larger and stronger than Josephine, and he recovered enough to strike her across the face with his uninjured hand, sending her stumbling backward into the examination table. It was at that moment, as Reginald reached for a discarded scalpel with his good hand, intending to finish what the gun had failed to accomplish, that the clinic's front door burst open, and Eli Quinn appeared, having grown concerned about his wife's late return and having ridden through the storm to check on her safety. He took in the scene instantly, his wife bleeding from a cut above her eyebrow, a wounded stranger reaching for a surgical blade, and years of law enforcement instinct propelled him into action before conscious thought could slow his response. "Drop it," Eli commanded, his own revolver already drawn and aimed steadily at Reginald Thorne. Reginald hesitated, calculating odds that had clearly shifted against him, then slowly released the scalpel, raising his uninjured hand in surrender while cradling his wounded wrist against his chest. "Marshal Quinn," Reginald said, some semblance of his former charming persona returning despite his desperate circumstances. "How fortunate you arrived to interrupt what was merely a private conversation between old acquaintances." "Save your lies for the judge," Eli growled, moving to secure the prisoner while keeping careful watch on Josephine, whose composed expression despite her bleeding forehead confirmed she was more shaken than injured. "Reginald Thorne, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Marshal Eli Quinn, for assault upon Josephine Mercer Quinn, and pending extradition proceedings, for the murder of your own father in Philadelphia." As Eli secured Reginald's hands with iron cuffs, checking his wounded wrist to ensure the man would not bleed to death before facing proper justice, Josephine finally allowed herself a moment of trembling reaction to the danger she had just survived. "You are hurt," Eli said, immediately turning his attention to her once Reginald was secured, his voice thick with concern and something rower, something approaching fury at the thought of what might have happened had he arrived even minutes later. "A superficial cut," Josephine assessed with clinical precision despite her shaking hands. "It will require a few stitches but nothing more serious. I have suffered worse injuries treating difficult patients." Eli pulled her into his arms despite the blood and chaos of the scene around them, holding her tightly as the reality of how close he had come to losing her finally penetrated his own composed exterior. "I thought I had lost you," he whispered into her hair. "When I saw him standing there, saw that gun, I thought my heart would stop entirely." "I am here," Josephine said, echoing the words she had spoken to him during his own crisis months earlier. "I am safe, Eli. We are both safe now. It is truly finished." The following weeks brought resolution to the terrible saga that had begun with poison at their wedding and nearly ended with murder in a snow-covered clinic. Reginald Thorne, facing overwhelming evidence of his crimes both in Wyoming Territory and in Philadelphia, ultimately confessed to his father's murder in exchange for avoiding execution, accepting instead a life sentence that would keep him permanently imprisoned and unable to threaten Josephine or Eli ever again. The formal confession, combined with the evidence Josephine had carefully gathered and preserved, provided complete vindication for her original suspicions about the elder Thorne's death, clearing her name of any lingering questions about her flight from Philadelphia 6 months prior. More importantly, it meant she could finally, fully reclaim her identity as Dr. Josephine Mercer, no longer needing to hide behind the pretense of mere nursing credentials. "The Territorial Medical Board has received your credentials from Pennsylvania," Dr. Abernathy told her one morning, several weeks after Reginald's arrest, as winter's grip on Cheyenne began finally showing signs of loosening toward an early spring thaw. "They have reviewed your case, examined the circumstances of your original departure from Philadelphia, and formally recognize your standing as a licensed physician here in Wyoming Territory." "Truly?" Josephine asked, scarcely daring to believe that the secret she had guarded so carefully could finally become an openly celebrated truth. "Truly," Dr. Abernathy confirmed, a warm smile creasing his weathered face. "In fact, given my own advancing age and increasingly unreliable eyesight, I have recommended to the town council that you assume full responsibility for Cheyenne's medical needs. This town needs a properly trained physician, Josephine, and it has had one hiding in plain sight for months now." The announcement that Cheyenne's beloved Marshal's wife was, in fact, a fully credentialed physician spread through the town with the speed characteristic of frontier gossip, though the reaction proved far more positive than Josephine had originally feared. Having witnessed firsthand her skill in saving Marshal Quinn's life, and having subsequently learned of her courage in defending herself against a murderous attacker, the community embraced her true identity with an enthusiasm that spoke to genuine respect rather than mere tolerance. Women who had previously felt uncomfortable discussing certain medical matters with male doctors began seeking Josephine's expertise specifically, grateful for a physician who understood their particular concerns with both professional competence and personal empathy. Ranchers and cowboys, initially skeptical of a woman doctor's capabilities, found themselves won over after witnessing her skillful treatment of everything from broken bones to snake bites, her steady hands and clear-eyed diagnosis earning respect that transcended their initial prejudices. Eli, for his part, found himself immensely proud of his wife's public recognition, taking obvious pleasure in introducing her not as merely his wife, but as Dr. Josephine Mercer Quinn, watching with satisfaction as new acquaintances registered surprise, followed quickly by genuine respect once they witnessed her competence firsthand. "You are becoming something of a local legend," he told her one evening, several months after Reginald's trial had concluded with a guilty verdict and permanent imprisonment. "The woman doctor who saved the Marshal's life at their own wedding then defended herself against a murderer with nothing but a surgical scalpel. Children in town are already turning it into playground stories. I hope the stories at least give me credit for accurate medical technique," Josephine said with dry humor, rather than some exaggerated tale of supernatural healing powers. "I heard one version where you brought me back from actual death using ancient healing magic learned from mysterious sources," Eli said, laughing at the memory. "The truth of your training and skills seemed too straightforward for some storytellers' tastes." Their marriage, forged in crisis and tempered by shared danger, continued deepening through that first year together, with a richness that surprised even them. Eli learned to appreciate having a wife whose intelligence and independence matched his own strength and courage, finding in their partnership a completeness he had never expected to discover after years of believing marriage incompatible with his dangerous profession. Josephine, for her part, discovered in Eli a partner who never once felt threatened by her superior medical knowledge or her fierce independence, who instead celebrated these qualities as essential parts of who she was, treating her not as a delicate creature requiring protection, but as an equal capable of protecting herself while also choosing to share her life with someone she trusted completely. Their clinic, expanded with proper funding from the town council once Josephine's credentials became officially recognized, grew to serve not just Cheyenne, but surrounding ranches and smaller settlements throughout the territory. She trained local women interested in nursing, passing along both practical skills and the confidence to pursue medical knowledge, despite societal expectations that discouraged such ambitions. One particular case, occurring during their second spring together, demonstrated to the entire community just how far Josephine's reputation had grown. A serious cholera outbreak began spreading through a nearby mining camp, threatening to decimate the population before proper containment could be established. While male doctors from surrounding areas hesitated, uncertain how to address the rapidly spreading contagion, Josephine organized a systematic response drawing on medical knowledge about sanitation and water contamination that was still considered cutting-edge, even in Eastern medical circles. She established quarantine protocols, personally traveled to the mining camp despite the risk of infection, and worked tirelessly alongside Eli, who insisted on accompanying her both for protection and out of genuine desire to support her efforts, treating dozens of afflicted miners while training local volunteers in proper sanitation practices that ultimately contained the outbreak before it could spread further into the general population. "You saved that entire camp," Eli told her, exhausted but proud, as they finally returned home after 2 weeks of grueling medical work. "And who would have died from ignorance about proper water sanitation are alive today because you understood something that most doctors in this territory have never even considered. We saved that camp," Josephine corrected gently. "Your organizational skills coordinating supplies and maintaining order among frightened, sick men were just as essential as my medical knowledge. This partnership works precisely because we bring different but equally important strengths to every challenge we face together." By their second anniversary, Josephine discovered she was expecting their first child, a development that brought both profound joy and, for Eli, a resurgence of the protective instincts that had always characterized his personality, now amplified by concern for his wife's well-being during pregnancy. "I am a physician, Eli," Josephine reminded him with amused patience during one particular evening when he had hovered anxiously while she performed routine household tasks. "I understand pregnancy and childbirth far better than most doctors in this territory. You need not worry so excessively about every small activity." "Forgive me for wanting to protect the woman I love," Eli replied, though he did retreat slightly from his overprotective hovering. "You saved my life, defended yourself against a murderer, and have single-handedly transformed medical care throughout this territory. I suppose I simply want the chance to take care of you for once, even if you insist you require no such care." Josephine's expression softened at this admission, understanding the vulnerability beneath his usually confident exterior. "You do take care of me, Eli, every single day, in ways that have nothing to do with medical knowledge. You accepted my true identity without hesitation. You stood beside me through danger and never once treated my independence as a threat to your masculinity. You have given me a home, a purpose beyond mere survival, and a love I never believed possible after everything that happened in Philadelphia. That is more care than any physician could ever provide for themselves." Their first child, a son they named William after Eli's father, arrived on a crisp autumn morning 9 months later, with Josephine, ever practical, having prepared meticulously for every possible complication despite her confidence in a straightforward delivery. Eli, banished to the next room per tradition despite his protests that he had faced down armed outlaws and could certainly witness childbirth, paced anxiously until finally permitted entry to meet his newborn son. "He has your stubbornness already," Josephine informed her exhausted but delighted husband, cradling their son who had apparently inherited both his father's lung capacity for vocal complaint and his mother's alert, curious eyes. I predict a challenging childhood ahead for us both. As long as he inherits your intelligence alongside whatever stubbornness came from my side of the family, I suspect we shall manage adequately, Eli replied, gazing at his son with an expression of wonder that Josephine found more moving than any romantic declaration he had previously offered. Their family continued growing over subsequent years, blessed with a daughter named Margaret 2 years after William's birth, followed by another son, Daniel, 3 years after that. Josephine balanced her medical practice with motherhood through careful organization and the assistance of Constance Quinn, who had grown to adore her daughter-in-law despite initial shock at discovering her true profession, willingly helping with childcare whenever medical emergencies demanded Josephine's immediate attention. Eli, meanwhile, continued serving as marshal for many years, though he gradually transferred more responsibilities to Deputy Harmon as their family grew, wanting more time to spend with Josephine and their children, rather than constantly risking his life in dangerous confrontations that had once defined his daily existence. The town of Cheyenne itself transformed alongside their family, growing from a rough frontier settlement into a more established community, as the railroad brought increased commerce and population growth throughout the 1880s. Josephine's clinic expanded into a proper small hospital, training an increasing number of nurses, and even, eventually, mentoring 2 young women who followed her example in pursuing formal medical education back east, inspired by her success in proving that women could excel as physicians despite societal prejudices. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Eli surprised Josephine with a small celebration at the same hotel where their original wedding had nearly ended in tragedy, though this time surrounded by their 3 children, close friends, and a community that had come to deeply respect and appreciate the remarkable woman who had arrived as a mysterious stranger years before and become an essential pillar of their frontier town. 10 years ago tonight, Eli said, raising a toast during their small celebration, careful to avoid any whiskey given the painful memories associated with their original wedding reception. I nearly died on this very floor, poisoned by a man who wanted to destroy everything good in your life, Josephine. Instead, that terrible night became the beginning of the most remarkable decade of my existence, married to a woman whose intelligence, courage, and skill continue to astonish me every single day. To think, Josephine replied, raising her own glass of sparkling cider, that a wedding day poisoning could lead to such profound happiness. I suppose Reginald Thorne inadvertently gave us quite a story to tell our grandchildren someday, though I doubt we shall include the more graphic medical details when the children are young enough to be frightened by descriptions of strychnine convulsions. Their guests laughed at this dark humor, understanding by now the particular resilience and grace with which Josephine had transformed even the most traumatic experiences into sources of strength rather than lasting fear. Their children grew up hearing carefully edited versions of their parents' dramatic courtship, learning valuable lessons about courage, intelligence, and the importance of standing firm against injustice regardless of societal expectations. William eventually followed his mother's path into medicine, while Margaret, inheriting her father's steady hand and keen eye, became one of the territory's first female deputy marshals once the position opened to women decades later. Daniel, the youngest, chose ranching, content to build a quieter life working the land his parents had come to call home. Josephine continued practicing medicine throughout her life, eventually training an entire generation of frontier doctors and nurses, her reputation extending far beyond Cheyenne to encompass much of Wyoming territory. She never forgot the dark chapter of her past that had nearly cost her everything, but she also never allowed that darkness to define her, instead choosing to build a legacy of healing and empowerment that honored both her medical training and her hard-won independence. Eli, meanwhile, remained proud throughout their long marriage of the woman he had married, never once regretting the unconventional path their love had taken. From that first meeting at the stagecoach depot through the terror of near-death poisoning to the deep, abiding partnership that defined their subsequent decades together. He often told their children and grandchildren that the moment he truly fell in love with their mother was not during their courtship's romantic moments, but rather watching her save his life with calm, brilliant competence on their wedding day, recognizing in that instant that he had found a partner whose strength matched his own, whose intelligence exceeded his expectations, and whose fierce independence made their love not weaker, but infinitely stronger. They lived together for over 40 years, weathering the ordinary challenges of frontier life alongside the extraordinary drama that had marked their beginning, until Eli passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, with Josephine, then a distinguished elderly physician still practicing medicine part-time, holding his hand through his final moments just as she had held it during that terrifying wedding night so many decades before. Josephine continued for several more years afterward, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of courage and intelligence she had modeled throughout her remarkable life. When she finally passed at the age of 81, the entire town of Cheyenne, by then a proper city rather than a rough frontier settlement, paused to honor the memory of the woman who had arrived as a mysterious stranger, survived murderous danger through her own competence and courage, and ultimately transformed medical care throughout the territory while finding a love so profound it had begun with poison and ended, decades later, in peaceful, well-earned rest. Their story, passed down through generations of the Quinn family and remembered fondly by the town they had called home, remained a testament to the power of intelligence and courage triumphing over darkness, and to a love strong enough to weather any storm, born from crisis but sustained through decades of mutual respect, genuine partnership, and unwavering devotion that neither poison nor murder nor the passage of time could ever diminish.